You're in the classroom with Cat Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. Today's special guest is Andrew Taylor. Andrew has worked as a teacher, cluster educator, school leader and school improvement specialist over the past 40 years. He recently retired as the Executive Officer for Christian Schools Australia. Join us as we chat about coaching versus mentoring, how to build a peer coaching culture in schools, and why listening with the intent to understand, not to reply, is the most important skill a coach can have. You're listening to In the Classroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Alrighty, everybody. So today we're in the classroom with the one and only Andrew Taylor. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Kate. I appreciate it.
You're so welcome. So, Andrew, why don't we start off with a bit about you and your journey into education and particularly into school improvement and coaching? How did you land into this space and what was it like for you?
So my wife would be worried right now because she said, you're not going to shut him up for the next 20 minutes. So I will try and truncate it because it's been an interesting 40 years. I've just finished 40 years in education. So, but how I got into teaching was even in itself was interesting. I clearly remember after my second go of doing year 11, being called into the principal's office, finding my parents there and being invited not to attend school anymore. I used to say I was expelled, but technically I wasn't expelled. I was just told I wouldn't be allowed to enroll anymore. So after failing year 11 twice, it's the first time I remember my dad not going crazy at me, but he basically said, you're going to get a job. And the only subject I passed from year 8 onwards was home economics. So I thought, well, I might as well become a chef. So I actually did an apprenticeship as a chef. And as part of that, you have to go to trade school. And I clearly remember the graduation dinner after I graduated from trade school. One of my chef instructors pulled me aside and she said, Andrew, she said, you'll be an okay cook, but I think you should become a teacher. And she has seen me helping out my fellow apprentices and sort of putting them in front of me. And she just felt that I would be better off in a teaching role. And I kind of sat back and thought about that. And thought, okay, that sounds fair. Because quite honestly, I didn't enjoy a lot of the cooking role. I love to cook, but professionally, it wasn't that inspiring for me. So I went back and did my year 12 at 21 and then managed to talk my way into university because I didn't get a high enough. It was called an Anderson score in Victoria in those days. That's how old I am. And, but I didn't get a high enough score to get into university. So I managed to talk my way into teacher training and did my 4 years training and then became a home economics and hospitality teacher and really, really enjoyed it. Loved it. Loved working with students. Loved teaching. And so, just progressed. And like I said, that was 40 years ago when I started. And so I've been pretty much in education ever since. Had a number of experiences, which I've really appreciated. But how I got into the school improvement space was in 2005, which is 20 years ago. I found myself in a role in the Department of Education in Victoria where I was called a cluster educator, which was a system role, effectively coaching teachers. But we were told by our Deputy Secretary that our role was to fix bad teachers, particularly in the middle years. And as you can imagine, that probably sort of didn't inspire us so much. But through that role, I discovered this thing called peer coaching, which no one had heard of in Victoria. And so myself with a couple of other cluster educators, as we're called, we managed to convince our clusters to fund bringing a trainer out from America in this thing called peer coaching. And he trained a whole bunch of us as peer coaches, and I sort of got involved in that. And then I was blessed in 2005 to win an award called the Lindsay Thompson Fellowship, which at that stage was given to one teacher in Victoria and it was $50,000 and 12 weeks study leave, which you had to do overseas. And so I ended up going to America and investigating coaching across a range of different school districts and settings across the US. And then I just found myself wanting to work in that area and help teachers be just that little bit better every day. And so I just sort of, I guess, when doors have opened, I've walked through them, and I ended up being a deputy principal and a principal of a primary school, even though I was secondary trained, and that's a long story in itself. But have just really found myself drawn into this space of helping teachers and leaders find ways to be just that little bit better every day. And that's the short that's the short version.
That's so good, Andrew. And I feel like that was how we met. We actually met through one of your peer coaching masterclasses. And I would say that at the moment, from my experience in interactions, that coaching is becoming more popular with schools in terms of adoption. However, there tends to be this confusion between coaching, mentoring, instructional coaching, peer coaching. Can you unpack those differences? Maybe just starting with coaching, what do we mean by that? And mentoring, what do we mean by that?
So let me just start with those two big words, because I think that's really important, and everyone sees it differently. So I'm going to give you my opinion based on my experience. The way I see the difference is that mentoring is generally someone who's been on the path you want to follow. They've had the experiences, they've made mistakes, they've learned, and they're willing to share that with someone else that's going to be on that path. So for me personally, I did an apprenticeship as a chef. So I was trained, but I was also mentored by a number of chefs who had been through that before me and understood the path that I was going to follow, and sort of talked about pitfalls and experiences, etc. So really what I argue mentoring is someone who has gone ahead of you on a path that you want to follow, so you connect with them to learn from them. So for me, that's mentoring. Coaching is more walking beside someone and helping them, again, improve or plot a path, but you're walking more beside them rather than ahead of them. Now, again, then you talked about the difference between instructional coaching and peer coaching, and then there's a whole range of other types of coaching. Cognitive coaching is a well-known model as well, and there's a whole bunch of others. But in education, we tend to see instructional coaching and peer coaching as the two main ones. Instructional coaching is very much someone who has a specific skill set and is taught how to share that skill set with others. And they may do it through a range of things like modeling practice, co-planning, observing practice, and giving feedback. So it is more, and it is usually focused on a particular skill set area. So for example, when I was in Victoria, we had a lot of what we called literacy coaches. And so they were highly skilled, particularly primary school teachers, highly skilled literacy teachers, and understood literacy really well. And so they were funded to be released from the classroom, sometimes half load, sometimes full load, and to coach other teachers in literacy skills and improving the way they teach literacy in the classroom. And we've seen numeracy instructional coaches, we've seen ICT or IT instructional coaches, but they tend to be focused on a particular skill set and focus on that. Peer coaching, which is the one I'm passionate about, is very much a teacher walking beside a colleague, and you don't have to be an expert in that particular area, because the number one skill you have is to ask questions to understand what should I see in the particular area that the teacher is wanting to improve on. And then you go look for that and give feedback on what you see, and then have a conversation about what could be next. So with a peer coach, first of all, it's a peer. So the teacher who is being coached says, I see you as a peer, and it's their job to decide whether you're a peer or not. And then it is about saying, what should I look for? What is it you want to improve? What do you think it's looking like? what should I look for, and then going and doing an observation and giving feedback, and then continuousing that in a cycle. So that's the way I see how different coaches operate in different ways.
I love that. And I feel like this next question about what makes coaching work in that sense, like what are the elements for a successful coaching relationship in a peer coach kind of setting?
Yeah. So the first one is the word you use. It's a relationship. There has to be some sort of relationship there. As you will know, Kate, when I do my training, I'm very firm in saying that coaching cannot be peer coaching cannot be mandated, and you cannot arbitrarily match people up because it's convenient. There has to be a relationship there as well. And then, of course, what underpins that is trust. And if there's no trust, the rest doesn't work. Because the reality is the person being coached, the teacher being coached, is exposing themselves to a colleague, and that's not something that we're used to doing. In reality, we work in a room with a bunch of students, but we do that by ourselves in most cases. Now, in different settings, there may be differences. So, for example, in primary, there may be a teacher aide often in the classroom, but a teacher aide can be a peer coach too. So, but it tends to be more, we operate by ourselves. And so to be willing to invite someone in is quite confronting and quite challenging. So if there's already a relationship that's underpinned by trust, that makes it a whole lot easier. So fundamental is having a relationship that's founded on trust. The second thing I would suggest is that there needs to be a process that underpins it, so people understand what is going to happen before, during, and after. As educators, as human beings, we rarely like to be surprised. And so if we know that there is a process that underpinned it, particularly one that's research and evidence-based, of which peer coaching is, people are more likely to engage in it. So if they're engaging with someone that they have a relationship with, that trust underpins that, and if there's a process that is going to be honoured, people are more likely to step into a process where they are exposing their practice to someone else, but it's in a way in which I have said what I want you to look for, I've asked you what the feedback should be, and then we can talk about that afterwards.
And I think that's just what you're getting at, Andrew, I can hear is just this observational cycle, this process that is very tight in terms of being intentional with the before, the during, and the after. And so for our listeners, can you walk us through the common, traps or mistakes coaches might make in the before, the during, and the after phases when it comes to coaching?
Yeah, I think the first one is teachers don't think they can coach another teacher. I'm speaking very generically or generally now, but teachers are often their own worst enemy, and they often don't think that they're as good as they actually are. And so when someone is approached potentially, say, to coach, oh, well, what could I add? What value can I add? And to a degree, that I get that, particularly if you're talking about the instructional coaching model. But in this peer coaching model, you actually are there just to report back what you see and then have a conversation about it. And so I think the first thing is that teachers often don't think that they can be a coach. That being said, I'm very strong on teaching people how to coach. Because teachers are teachers, we're taught how to teach well. Teaching is not coaching. And sometimes what you can see that if someone is asked to coach and they're not taught how to coach, they can actually turn into a teaching mode, which is not bad, but it's not what this process is about. And it's certainly not what the person who's being coached is potentially looking for. There is room for that in the after, but certainly not in the before and during. So that's probably the main area that I think that a potential pitfall, I guess, you're looking for in relation to a coaching process. The other one is, and this is not specifically a thing that teachers make, but the biggest challenge in coaching is time. I talk about the two four-letter words of teaching, time and busy. And the reality is to do a coaching process well, to do a cycle well and a number of cycles well, you've got to have time to do your pre-observation conversation. You've got to have time to do the observation. You've got to have time to do the post-observation you've got to have time to plan for the next stage and then do that cycle all over again. And that can often be a challenge. And quite honestly, pretty much every time I've come across a school that's tried to implement a coaching process or a coaching culture, which is really what we're talking about, is a culture, not necessarily just a process, it's because it's been too hard to sustain. And so working out how to sustain it is a big part of successfully building a coaching culture in a school.
Can we dig in bit more into the pre-observation culture, doing the actual observation and the post-observation?
Yeah.
So in terms of the pre-observation, what should a coach really be doing? What should peer coaches be doing when they're sitting together for that conversation? What should the focus be on? And how do you get to an agreed consensus about what it is that you're looking for?
Yep. So that's a great question, and that's an hour and a half session of my training. So we're going to have to skip through it fairly quick. But look, essentially, it's about asking good questions and understanding what the teacher who's being coached is looking for. Now, sometimes they don't know, but usually they have an idea. In the training I talk about, teachers generally focus on three particular areas. They talk about classroom management, pedagogy, or student behaviour, which often fits into classroom management, but they're the three areas. So initially a teacher might say to their coach, I want you to come in and watch my students and how well they're engaged. Oh, that's the other, engagement is a big one. How well are they engaged? Well, the first question you need to ask then, it would be, what do you believe engagement looks like? What are you looking for in your classroom? So that you can understand, because one of the things that a coach has to be really careful is that they don't go in with their lens, a coloured lens, but they go in with a lens looking through the teacher they're coaching. Now, that's difficult, and that's why I talk about you need to be trained to do that, and you need to practice that over time. But basically, what I'm saying is that it's asking good questions to understand what the teacher is looking for, understanding what that looks like. We call them look fors, and then coming up with a process, usually some sort of data gathering tool, to actually record what the teacher actually, or the coach actually sees while the teacher is teaching. So, for example, if you're talking about, let's say they talk something about engagement. Well, first of all, you need to dig down and understand what do they mean by that? Well, what I would like to see is that when I break them into groups of three, that all three in each group are engaged in that conversation, that they're all contributing to the conversation. And so therefore I could then sit and watch as they worked in those groups and just take some anecdotal notes. And I might even have a seating chart. So I've got names of students about, well, in this group, all three shared well. But in this group, there was one person that really dominated the conversation. So that raises the consciousness of the teacher, and then they could come up with a strategy, whatever that could be, to actually then say, okay, next time I'm going to put together a strategy where I make sure that each of the students in the group contribute equally to the conversation. So understanding what it is, knowing what to look for, having a way to collect that data, and then reporting that data back and having a conversation about what could happen next.
So good. And I want to ask about those two things, because I feel like you covered the pre-observation with the asking good questions, but the observation part, I feel like this is a space where doing an observation is just assumed that you just get into a room. But there are a bunch of protocols in terms of, unpacking what an observation is and how you actually do an observation. Can you speak into that in terms of certain protocols, like being on time or lateness or things like that teachers should, or coaches should, just be mindful of when it comes to doing an observation in a classroom?
Yeah, great question, because it often is the area that can negatively affect the relationship or the process. So obviously on time, I think, is important. And I always suggest if you can be there 5 minutes before, but at least being there when the students are in the classroom. I think the second one is there's always often a comment, oh, but if there's a second person in the classroom, it affects the classroom. The students are going to act differently. My experience is that's not true. My experience is if the students are told that there's someone else going to be in the classroom, they're watching me teach, they're watching for this, the kids on the whole say, okay, fine, no worries. Now, the younger ones, yeah, they're probably going to be a bit distracted, so you might put in a different protocol. But essentially, if the students are told why this is happening, they just get on and do what they're asked to do. So I haven't found that having that second person in the classroom really causes much of an issue, particularly as you build the culture. So the students are used to having them in the classroom. So the first time there might be a little bit, but over time, as you build culture, students are just used to it. And so that's often something is making sure the students understand. Another one is collect the data you're asked to collect. That's really important. One, there's nothing worse than going to your post-observation conversations. Oh, I was so engaged in your lesson that I forgot to collect the data. So that can be one. But also the other thing is don't collect other data, which is often a temptation. Again, I'm not going to go through my whole full day training program with you, but we do talk about other things. If the teacher says, did you see anything else? The strategy is yes, but let's talk about that another time because I need you to dissect what I've given you based on the actual topic area or focus that you've asked me to collect the data on. So there's those other things. And of course, I talk about duty of care always trumps. So if something's happening, but it's not your job to discipline a child either. Okay, so there's understanding what that is. So there are things that can go wrong. Coaches need to be aware of that. But the biggest thing is remember why you're there and ensure you do what you've agreed to do.
So good. Andrew, can we talk about the post-observation conversation? Because I feel like this is the space where feedback matters, how you deliver and give feedback matters, but also key skills that a coach needs to have a successful post-observation. Can you unpack that for me?
Yep. So the first thing I'm always fairly firm on is to say you need to prepare for your post-ob. So it is dangerous, in my opinion, to try and do the post-ob immediately after the observation. The teacher needs to think and process and let go because they're all going to think they've seen everything that went wrong. And because let's face it, there's never a perfect lesson. So they're going to think, oh, this didn't work, this happened. All they're going to see is that. So they need to process through their own reflection on the lesson and get to the end of that. The coach needs to prepare and say, well, okay, it might be aggregating the data, or it might be doing a little bit of analysis to see what they saw so they know what to report back. So there should be a time separation between the observation and the conversation that comes afterwards. The second one is, and this I think is a really important as far as language is concerned, quite honestly, particularly early on, the teacher is probably going to expect to hear the stuff that didn't work. And so what the coach needs to learn to do is, number one, say, go back and review what they asked to see. You asked me to focus on engagement. You asked me to focus on watching the groups and see how much interaction there was. Okay, so that's what you've asked me to do. So you reinforce that. And then I always use the language, what I saw was. So there's no judgment. It's just saying, this is what I saw, and you share what you say. So what I saw was this group, they were fantastic. They shared with each other. They listened. They were respectful, etc. This group over here, the one of the group dominated the whole time, and the other two ended up just sitting back. So this is what I saw, because you can't argue with pure data. And so therefore, the coach can present that data and then say, so how do you feel about that? Or how does that sit with you? Or what do you see from that? What can we learn from that to allow them to have control of what happens next? If the coach goes immediate into analysis themselves, you'll have an idea what you saw, why, and where they could go next, but it has to be owned by the teacher. And so it is. So what do you think about that? what do how do you feel about that? So that they can own the next part of the conversation.
How can a coach consider the way in which they hold that conversation without being a dominant force? Because I've heard you say this quote about most people do not listen with the intent to understand, right? They listen with the
Correct.
intent to reply. So
Correct.
how
Yeah.
can coaches be cognizant of that and overcome that?
So part of that is going back to my first point, preparation. So they need to prepare and anticipate what potentially could happen or where the conversation would go. And it's simply being disciplined to listen. And that is a skill which takes time and practice. And that's why I say I think coaches need to be trained to coach. And then the next step is my strongest suggestion when I work with schools or groups is to say, the next thing you do is practice with other people who are trained. So basically practice with those in your cohort because they know what should happen. And so they can help you with that. So it's almost coaching the coaching to coach. So it is part of that. But it is simply a discipline. Listening is a discipline. And so it's practicing that to listen and then to reflect rather than to control conversation.
I think that's what pushes it away from judgment as well. It really grounds you in the data. Yeah. That's great, Andrew. I mean, half an hour has flown by so quickly. My last question to you is, you've been in the field for 40 years. I mean, in education, that is a huge milestone. What would you say has really kept you going professionally throughout this time in which, you could have retired 20 years ago? But what's been keeping you going?
My wife would not have let me retire 20 years ago. It took her a while to get used to the idea I'm retiring now. But look, what have I learned? I think that my number one is education is all about relationships. And we understand that totally with kids most of the time, but it's with everyone. Nothing happens well in education without positive relationships. And so it's about building those. Therefore, it's about understanding, but it's also about forgiveness. It's about recognizing that others have value and point of view value, which might not always be the same as yours. So for me, my number one thing that I have learnt and then worked on for 40 years, but particularly the last 20, is about recognizing the value of relationships to get things done, not to manipulate, but to recognize the other person with the value that they bring as well, whether it's a student, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a leader, whether it's a parent. It's all about relationships. I'll never forget, in my first year of teaching, I actually ended up teaching with my health and human development teacher when I was in high school. I ended up teaching with her at my first teaching job. And after about 3 weeks probably, and she was in my classroom a lot because we're in a portable and our office is in there. She pulled me aside one day and she said, "Andrew, I need you to learn this and live it. And it's simply, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar." And essentially it was saying, treat people well, don't treat them badly, treat people well, build relationship, and you'll get more done. And I've pretty much tried to live that, particularly professionally, but also personally the rest of my life. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, and I'm going to quote my good friend, Dr. John Eckert from Baylor University, teaching is the profession that impacts every other profession. So that makes it fundamentally important for us to do the best we can at all times. We need to be the best we can all the time. That doesn't mean we need to be perfect. We can't be perfect, but we need to work to be the best we can in whatever context, because we are the profession that impacts every other profession that there is.
So beautiful, Andrew. I mean, we'll just end it on that note, but thank you so much for sharing your time, your wisdom, and your expertise on the podcast.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In the Classroom. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, rate me 5 stars, and leave a review. Don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might find it inspiring. That's all from me, and I'll see you next episode. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.